Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Jarvi. Jared and I are going to be breaking down how you can use social media as a tool in the toolbox as a coach or clinician. Social media is one of those things that is ever evolving and ever growing in today's day and age, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. Now, don't be mistaken, this episode is not a guide on how to grow a giant social media following. In fact, Jared and I are probably not the best guys to offer you advice on that. However, we do break down how to use social media as a tool to get new ideas, connect with other individuals, and so much more. We also break down the dangers that do exist, how to spot less than stellar information that is available online, and what to do if you find that sort of thing, how to confront someone professionally, and so much more. So, Jared and I really cover a lot of ground in this episode today. I highly recommend you check out Jared and all the amazing work that all of his other colleagues at UNC are doing as well. They're some of the best in the game, and I think the world of them. Episodes like this are made possible by ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and can help you and your athletes to win more and hurt less. For more on ISOFIT, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Jared, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for being here.
I am so happy to be on, man. This is awesome. I'm glad we got to connect and make this happen.
Yeah, dude. And shout out to your other amazing folks at UNC there between Eric and John. I mean, the whole crew that way. You guys are really good at what you do. But for people who maybe aren't familiar with you or all the incredible stuff that you get to do on the day to day, whether it's with lacrosse or rowing and so on that way, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great stuff that you do, Jared?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the Assistant Director of Sports Performance and Sport Science Coordinator for University of North Carolina. My direct team responsibilities are women's lacrosse and rowing. I also assist with our women's basketball program. Of course, sports science coordinator, so I'm in charge of, kind of overseeing and directing our sports science approach for all the athletes in our Olympic sports. Yeah, and you mentioned it. I work with really, really great people. All of our staff are, some of my closest friends, and the work that we do, I mean, it wouldn't be good without, I think, everybody collaborating on what we do. So very lucky to be where I am, and it's a good staff, good people.
Yeah, no, definitely. How did you end up in Carolina, Jared? Because I know when we met and chatted for, I feel like hours in Baltimore that way, you were telling me that you kind of grew up in the middle of nowhere, Michigan. So how'd you get all the way down there to Carolina?
Yeah, so I mean, I started, as you said, up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I graduated with a high school class of 17 people. So, I mean, it's a small town. I started out my career at Northern Michigan University, did my undergrad there, and they, for some reason, hired me on as an assistant strength coach right after I graduated. I was very lucky to be given way too much responsibility really, really early on. As me and one other guy just, ripping out all the strength conditioning programs there and let me really kind of cut my teeth and get a ton of experience writing programs, working with athletes, and living in the weight room. Did that for a couple years, and then I realized, one, I don't know enough about this field, and two, I don't want to be in small town Michigan forever. So I went headhunting for a grad program at great university, and thankfully I got a chance to go to University of Michigan. Did grad school there, and for some reason they also hired me as soon as I graduated. I was able to work at Michigan as a fellow for a couple years, and then launched into Penn State for 3 years, and then down to Carolina. And Carolina to me was kind of a special one because three times in my life I tried to get to Carolina. The first one was as an undergrad. I had the chance to actually go as an undergrad right out of high school. Chose to stay in Michigan because they let me play soccer. Again, I don't know if that was smart or not, but I did it. Um, then I went to grad school. I was looking for the best kinesiology programs in the country, and the first Google result I got had Michigan, North Carolina, and Miami. And so I did the whole nine with UNC. Went to a grad school interview. They offered me a position. It would have been a fully paid GA position at UNC, but it was focused more on exercise physiology in the lab and not in the weight room. And so I was like, sorry, UNC, I'm going to Michigan. And then finally, third time's the charm. while I was at Penn State, I got that chance to apply and work at UNC, and it all worked out. The beautiful area. I've got some family here, and it all kind of worked out for me.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I think that's incredible how you literally went from a town even smaller than my middle of nowhere small town that I grew up in. And you're now kind of the sports science and data guy at UNC, from what it sounds like, and part of a collective team that, from my experience, is one of the best in the country when it comes to human performance and sports performance at that D1 level. You guys are really great at what you do. And it's so interesting because, just like you, I'm that small town kid, middle of nowhere. And I didn't really have a whole lot of like exposure to this sports performance world. And I didn't really know what was out there. And I wasn't really big in this like online presence that seems to exist nowadays, Jared. But I feel like nowadays everything is online. And it seems like everyone is looking for like the answers to problems on Instagram as opposed to
Mhm.
actually digging into the research or opening a book or having conversations with coaches. A lot of people are looking for, an Instagram post that gives them the answer. In fact, so much so that I've even seen other coaches and clinicians try to like open up Instagram and figure out what their next exercise is going to be in a session with someone. And I think it's getting to the point where it's just out of hand. And I think a lot of coaches and clinicians are forgetting how to actually solve problems, how to learn, and then how to have conversations with peers and athletes to actually move the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, social media, gosh, it's here to stay, right? As much as we might complain about it, it's always going to be here. Again, kind of my small town upbringing, I personally don't care a ton about social media. If somebody told me like, hey, you can have 100,000 followers right now, I'd say, okay, it doesn't really change my life at all. I don't care. But that being said, right, like I think it's a fantastic tool because we live in an age now where every person has the ability to have all of the world's knowledge, in their fingertips, and that's an amazing thing. But it has to be somewhat tempered, right? Like, we can't just take every single thing ever put on Instagram as gospel because, well, it's just not, right? And understanding that while we all have access to all the information, also everybody has a voice, whether that's good or bad. So, it's kind of a different landscape than what we're used to even, 10 years ago.
Right. You almost have to have this sort of like, for lack of a better way to put it, bullshit filter
Hmm.
to be able to filter out what you're seeing, the claims that are being made, and then how it actually fits in your framework or what you're actually reading is, it possibly even correct, because I see a lot of outlandish claims made sometimes about certain exercises and certain movements almost being like the cure-all for everything, when in reality it's just like basic active range of motion.
Sure.
And I think that there's a time and a place for everything. There's value in everything, and we're always open to learning more, but sometimes people just go a little too far for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's understanding, first of all, like the platforms themselves, the currency on those platforms is views, right? Views, watch time, it's things like that. The currency is not truth. And so, we see this a lot in sports talk, right? In politics, but like you get to a point where shenanigans begat more shenanigans, and it's like constantly one upping opinions where you can't have a very moderate opinion of, hey, this could be a good exercise in this many contexts, right? Instead you have to say this is the best exercise for everything because that plays to the currency of the platform. And so one, I think we have to reframe what it is before we start to take all of our health, fitness, performance advice from social media. And then from there, where we can take the information that is there and take the value from it.
Yeah, definitely. And, to your point, going off of that best exercise example, because I see those videos all the time, there's times when it might actually be the best exercise for something, right? And there's a research
Hmm.
article attached or multiple showing, this is really effective, which is great. But, if my client, my athlete can't do it, then it's not the best exercise for them. So again, sort of
Yeah.
having that filter to say like, okay, I can actually learn from this. This might be a good thing. but I really can't apply it right now. So I have to go with, something that might be the third or fourth best thing, but it's the best thing for what I need right now, as opposed to the
Right.
best thing, period.
No, absolutely. I think like one of the, kind of more hot topic exercises out there is like 90-degree squats versus full range squats, right? Like I've seen that debate 1,000 times from 1,000 different people. During COVID, when I had way too much time on my hands, I may or may not have engaged in far too many fights, right? Due to 90-degree squats. And again, it comes down to like, yeah, there are many instances where 90-degree squats are my go-to exercise of choice, right? Whether it be in some instance of pain or function where somebody can't get full ranges of motion, or in a performance setting where, for example, I've seen shot putters and javelin throwers doing partial range of motion squats for various reasons, right? Yeah, it's a great exercise, but like understanding usage is kind of the whole point, and that's when you need to step back from, all right, well, this post says it's the best exercise all the time. Okay, well, if you're speaking in an absolute like that, probably want to take a step back and understand some context.
You have to choose your wording carefully. And it's so interesting that we bring this up because I have been trying to post more stuff, and maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I don't really know. But the one thing I try to watch really closely myself is the wording that I use, because, if someone goes online and tries something that I post and then they get injured doing it, or they misinterpret it from what I meant, I feel like that's probably going to end up falling on me at the end of the day because they got it from my post. And I think a lot of times people forget that. They think, well, I'm online, I can say whatever. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. It's different than an in-person conversation. I think a lot of times people seem to act a little bit more tough or act differently behind a keyboard than they do in person. And it's one of those things where I think we really need to be careful in this online fitness world to kind of provide that same kind of value or same context online as much as we can as we might approach it in person.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. And I would even take it a step further in that, in this space, right, we need to be held to a much higher standard. And so truthfully, I've got no problems with like if somebody calls me out for something I say incorrectly, or, somebody else calling out somebody else for saying, hey, this is just improper, language or information for our space, right? Because the problems that come from that is like if somebody's just willy-nilly able to say whatever they want, well, guess what? Like my dad, he's a carpenter. He has no idea of health, fitness, strength, performance, right? He might just take that and say, okay, well then I could never do a full range squat ever. It's like, well, maybe that's not what's best for him, And so I think our field needs to hold ourselves to kind of cut through some of the nonsense that's out there every single day.
We keep coming back to this point that there's nonsense out there, but there's also diamonds amongst the rough, and there's a lot of good content that can come out there, and there's a great learning piece that can come from people sharing ideas like this. So
Mm-hmm.
how is it that you would go about using social media yourself in the strength and conditioning and human performance setting that way? What kind of things do you look for? Are you pulling up profiles and looking at bios to see if someone has certain letters and only listening to that, or are you just looking for like certain like keywords or a certain like language, or what kind of things do you look
Yeah.
for when you're in the online space there, Jared?
Yeah, so for me, it's kind of context dependent, right? Like I try to go on to, an Instagram and I'll think like, all right, what am I trying to get out of this, right? My most common use case is I need a spark of creativity. So if I'm trying to figure out what exercise I can do for, a certain purpose, I might go on and like, all right, so I'm working with some lacrosse players and I want to work on change of direction. Well, I might go on and search some various lacrosse coaches and see the kind of things that they do, and see like, all right, does it make sense and does it fit my model for training? All right, great. Well, then maybe that's something that can shake up my program a little bit, right? Get me out of my norm, give me something that can spark a different stimulus in my athletes. Awesome. I think that's a valid way to do it. If I'm going on for more education, I have to be a lot more selective about, who I'm trying to learn from. For me personally, what I usually will try to do is find people who, are published in, actual peer-reviewed literature and try to get visuals to their ideas, if that makes sense. So for example, if I'm looking at, his research on force plates and different variables and testing methodologies, I might try to find some of those researchers or maybe their departments and, all right, let me see what that research article was talking about, and can I see maybe an example of their force plate testing protocols, and try to give me a little bit more color to the research that I'm trying to read, right? I like to think about the social media as the icing, but really the peer-reviewed research is the cake for me. I do realize that I live in a different world than kind of most people in, sort of, UNC performance and me being in, kind of sports science role. So, I think about, and I tell my athletes this all the time. It's like, well, okay, if you're scrolling Instagram, like, one, what are you looking for? If you just ask yourself that simple question, that might solve a lot of problems, right? And then for like my dad, if he was to know what social media was, and he wanted to look at social media, he might, I might advise him, okay, well, does it make logical sense? I think, again, we often get very inflammatory with, like, the things we see on social media. And so can you look at that and say, you know what, this is like a logical idea, it might be okay, right? Usually I think the bullshit artists just don't use simple logic, and the advice I gave to my mom one time was like, my mom's a big Star Wars fan, and I said, Mom, Sith speak only in absolutes, right? Well, so do bullshit artists on Instagram. If they're using absolute statements, then you're probably in for a bad time. Usually the best people, even if I don't know who they are, they're going to say things like, hey, this could be a great exercise. It depends on your context, or depending on your goals, this is something that we do at our facility, right? When you see phrases like that, it shows me like a willingness to be wrong and a healthy mindset of like, all right, I'm willing to be wrong and grow if this is not for everybody. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And almost reframing the way we look at social media. I love your point about speaking in absolutes, and there's so much to unpack there, Jared. I mean, reframing the way we look at social media and using it as a tool to help us or dive deeper or look through another lens or just think about things in a different light, so to speak, as opposed to, oh, wow, I like what this person is doing, I'm going to plug that in my program and go. Because the minute you start program hopping like that, you throw out all of the results. I don't care if you're an athlete or a coach or a PT or whatever it is, the less consistent you become, the less results you're going to experience. I think that there's so
Right.
much value in actually having some type of framework to work from and then working on it consistently over time. That's why guys like you are so essential in the strength and conditioning piece, right? If you don't have a framework or a program to follow, like, hey, in the off season, we need to address these things for these people, and here's how we're going to do it. When we're in season, we're going to do these things. If we don't have that and we just make it randomized chaos, then we don't know what's actually going to provide us value and insight and what's going to, have the results that we're looking for. If we're constantly, you mentioned research a few times there. If we're constantly changing 10 different variables in research every single time we do any kind of test that way, then we don't know which one of the 10 is actually providing us the value that we want. We just have to guess at it. And in reality, every time we work with an athlete, it's sort of like research. It's a case study for that given athlete at that given moment in time. N equals 1. So if we change too many things at one time, again, we don't know what thing actually had the effect and outcome we want. So I think that you're right. It can definitely be a great tool to get new ideas and think outside of the box and appreciate a new line of thinking. But I love the litmus tests that you outlined and saying, like, does it make sense? What is the logic here? Can I follow what this person is saying? Because sometimes I see people post, an entire session they did with athletes, and I love looking at it and I go, you know what, this is really well thought out. This is well put together. I see what they're trying to do here, and I think they did a great job at it. Maybe it's different
Yeah.
than how I would have approached it, but they accomplished their goal. And then other times I look at it and they'll say that they set out to do one thing, but I think they get lost along the way, or they're too diluted and they try to do too much, or they try and get too fancy and cute with it. And, I look at the clip of their athlete and the athlete's not really doing what they say they should be doing. So, understanding that we have to keep the main thing, to use the words of Molly Benetti. And if the main thing is strength and conditioning and getting the best from our athletes, then we have to make sure that's the forefront of what we do, and we're not just doing things in order to, get that recording clip and then get 500 likes on Instagram or whatever.
One of my favorite like examples of social media that just made me laugh, especially in strength and conditioning, was a few years ago, LeBron James posted a video of him doing some squats. All right. And you can go find the clip, just search some LeBron James squats. And he's doing some like wide stance squats to slightly above parallels. Right. And I remember laughing because you go through and there's thousands of comments about like terrible depth. That's not a good squat. Like, gotta do better. And then it's like, guys, this is LeBron James, who is heralded for his ability to, be a great athlete and his longevity in a sport where there isn't longevity. And it's like, again, kind of like, take a step back and look at what you're doing here. Like what you're saying is like, oh, this is horrible, but yet you don't know the context of that exercise within his program, when that was filmed. It could have been off season, in season. It could have been, any number of circumstances as to why he's doing that particular exercise. And that was really one of the first times I was like, all right, we need to start having better conversations about social media. When we're complaining about LeBron James's squats, when again, he's one of the best to ever touch a basketball. I mean, I think again, we're not keeping the main thing.
Yeah, no, it's so funny because I feel like, again, going back to a point we made earlier, where sometimes people act and speak differently online versus in person. When you have one of the best basketball athletes to ever play the game, or some would argue the best basketball athlete to ever play the game, and you're going to come out there and critique his strength and conditioning programming and say that, your program could have been better, could have done better. I see the same thing all the time in like professional sports with when someone gets injured. At least a dozen people are going to comment and say, well, my program could have prevented that. Or, well, he should have done, I don't know, tib raises or some random thing like that. And it's like, just because you think that would have been the magic bullet doesn't actually mean it would. We don't really know these things, again, speaking in absolutes. And I just think some of the claims that people make in that regard is a bit outlandish, for lack of a better way to put it. So understanding that, there's a rhyme and a reason and rationale for everything, and you might not agree with it, but there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect that I reference a lot, where the more we think we know about something, the more we realize we don't actually know anything at all. So it's like, if it works for the best athlete in basketball and he's getting great results from it, then maybe we should change our framework and say, what can I learn from this and how can I apply it, as opposed to, well, this is stupid and it doesn't align with anything I've ever done, so I'm going to tear it down.
You brought him up, so I gotta talk about it. Tib raises. Like I think that a vast majority of of these online fitness coaches, they actually have decent programs that would work for most people. But man, those tib raises are getting everywhere. I laugh because the biggest claim I see is, oh, tib raises will save your knees, and that's training a muscle that doesn't actually cross over your knee joint. So explain that one to me, right? Like, I understand the ancillary benefits, I know, but at the same time, it's like, again, we get to this one-upsmanship of like, well, this exercise will save your knee. Well, it's pretty inflammatory, and in some instances and contexts, maybe, but there's no way you can say that.
Right. And it's interesting too, because again, people make crazy claims like that. And it's one of those things where I think we can be quick to critique based on theory and what we read that way. But sometimes I think that it's valuable to actually get in the trenches and try different things. And at least for me
100%.
personally, this is where I play around with stuff in my own programming. Like, I'll go into the gym and I'll go off program. It's like my favorite thing to do. Like, oh yeah, let's just go off program and see what happens. But I'm going to do that on myself. I'd rather get the self-experimentation out of the way. If athletes are paying me to be the one to rehab them or be the one to get them back to a higher level of performance, then I don't want them to be the experimentation blocks the first time I try something, I'll get it out of the way of myself. And then hopefully I learn something from it as far as, hey, maybe I'll apply this with an athlete, maybe I won't. How do you go about approaching that concept of self-testing and self-experimentation yourself, Jared? Is there an approach that you have developed to determining whether or not something is good or whether or not it makes the cut for a program that way? Or how do you kind of go about approaching that on your end?
Yeah, no, I think the first step is exactly as you said, is kind of going off my own programs and trying things, right? And again, I make fun of them a little bit, but tib raises was one of those things that I tried a bunch and, found some things like, hey, when I'm doing more conditioning work and running, maybe a few tib raises is a good idea. That's kind of my first step is try stuff on myself. And then from there, I'm kind of fortunate enough to be around quite a lot of athletes and interns that'll do this too. But I have developmental groups of athletes who I may do some more experimentation on, where it's like, okay, we've got red shirts who aren't going to play this year. We have the chance to up their training load a little bit, and maybe we can try some things that that aren't going to deviate them too far away, but not exactly on the same program as everybody else. That's a really good test case for some of those other exercises or modalities that maybe I wouldn't try with the full team right off the bat. And then from there, it's like, again, I'm the research guy, so it's like, all right, is there a biological basis for this to make sense? All right, let's look into that. Then let's question, is it feasible, right? So tib raises again is a great example of like, all right, I see the biological basis. Is it feasible? Well, I don't have 30 tib bars, so it's kind of hard for me to implement that with a team. Yeah, we could do the body weight version, but apples oranges kind of thing. And so if it's got a biological basis and it is feasible, then it's like implement in a small group or on myself, and then kind of make a bigger determination from there. Usually a lot of those types of exercises were things from my time in baseball, right? Baseball is a very like, we're just going to try a bunch of stuff sport. And there are some things where, I've met with, had a pitcher who, hey, coach, this exercise, I felt really good when I do it. Great, right? Like, of that athlete, not something I might typically program, but he saw benefit. Oh, let's try it on this guy. Oh, he saw benefit too. Well, so now we can start to think about maybe implementing something, that exercise or something like it, to help in those situations.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's so interesting because the way you approach exercise in that sense with the baseball example that you gave is the same way I approach a lot of different modalities in the PT space. Like, KT tape, for example. Like, I think it is a little bit overhyped in my opinion. But and if an athlete comes in and we put it on their knee and they tell me they feel better and they were able to play without pain, do I rip it off and never put it back on because I don't necessarily think it does all the things that people claim it does? Probably not, because we're experiencing a win right now. So, sometimes we don't know why we're getting a win. Maybe it's a placebo, or maybe it's something scientific that we don't understand yet. But a win is a win at the end of the day, no matter how ugly or how pretty it looks.
100%, yeah.
And your other point on the exercise side of things as well is, I think a lot of times athletes bounce ideas off of each other and can sometimes be a great source of inspiration for exercises. Like, a lot of times I'll kind of have athletes come in and they'll be showing me something and it's like, actually, I can make an exercise off of that. We could, problem solve this and turn it into a movement that actually kind of addresses the exact thing you're talking about. So sometimes being willing to go so outside of the box that instead of just going to the textbook and the research articles or just going to Instagram, you sometimes just go to the athlete that's standing right in front of you and hear them out for 2 seconds, because some of them are a lot smarter than I think we give them credit for sometimes.
100%. And truthfully, I'd say they're geniuses in the context of their sport. It's the ones that I get to see. I mean, go watch some UNC women's lacrosse players do stick work. It's mesmerizing. They're incredible. And so, they have a better understanding of, how some exercises will affect their hands, their shoulders, things like that than I ever will. And so, I mean, it's simplistic. It's about as low tech as you can have. Just ask them, right? ask them, hey, what has worked for you in the past? Oh, awesome. Maybe that's something we can implement for you for sure. And then take it to the whole team, you know?
Definitely. And I guess what does that process look like for you, that framework from, hey, we have this new idea, we're starting to experiment with it. How do we then apply it to, the team setting that way? Or how do we determine whether or not it's like met the mark from fitting into the Jared Jarvi framework that way? Or what kind of systematic approach, I guess, would you propose for other coaches to determine whether or not they should use something in a program that way?
I think it comes down to, for me, right? Like it's understanding, what am I trying to get out of an exercise, a session, a week, a month, a full year annual plan, right? Because exercises are wildly interchangeable. And I'm happy to change out exercises for many reasons, but if the replacement still gives me the same stimulus I'm looking for, right? And so, when thinking about my own programs, it's like, okay, I want to build lower body force output, right? We can do that with a back squat. But if, all of my lacrosse athletes say, hey, something about back squats just doesn't work for me. Cool, we can front squat. We can lunge, we can, trap bar deadlift. We can do so many different things to build that quality, right? And so when it comes to, looking at, say, an exercise from Instagram, for example, my first thing is like, okay, one, does it do the same thing that I'm looking to get out of that training program? Okay, well, then it might be a viable option. Two, is it a wild deviation from what we currently do, right? Right, for example, like, yes, you can build lower body force output, with, a hydraulic leg press. And it's like, well, okay, but that's, there's cost and feasibility, and it's wildly different than what we've currently done. So it's like, yeah, I'm not going to necessarily implement that right now, but it's looking at, can I match my program to what I'm trying to get to the athlete? And so, what I've started to do is start to build out different training groups based on the qualities we're trying to build. And then some of my older athletes get some individualization and get some say in that, where if we're trying to build lower body force output, I will have some athletes who are back squatting, some are front squatting, some are on a pitch shark, for example. And, it's trying to individualize to what that athlete needs, as long as, and they know this, right? As long as that lower body force output improves. And we see that on all of our monitoring and testing. And if we see that, then fantastic. Like, the exercise doesn't matter. If our metrics go up and they're able to be elite lacrosse players, then awesome.
Yeah, exactly. I love that approach. I mean, again, going back to that phrase from before, I feel like I'm using it all the time lately. You keep the main thing, right?
That's right.
Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be the prettiest exercise program ever that gets 2,000 likes on Instagram.
Yep.
If it keeps them on the field, keeps them feeling good and performing at the level that you want, it's doing the job, period.
Yep.
End of discussion at that. Like, you don't need to like go out there and try and make it more sexy and sport specific by, instead of doing like a cable chop with a rope attachment, hey, instead of that, we're going to do the little ankle cuff, but we're going to put it around their wrist, and they're going to hold the lacrosse stick in their hand as they come across to make it more sport specific. Like, it doesn't have to be like that. If it gets the
Yeah.
job done at the end of the day, go for the low hanging fruit. And it's
Yeah.
interesting because we were talking earlier on, off recording, on facility design that way. I think a lot of people, when they're designing their facility, they think they need every single fancy bell and whistle in there to make these things happen. And it's like, you can get a lot done with some very simple concepts. You don't need, a $20 million strength and conditioning facility to get a team of 40 to 50 athletes to maintain and improve over a
Yeah.
period of time. You can get a lot done for a lot less. It's just a matter of, again, understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then how you can apply it appropriately. And I love your point too, about individualization, because I feel like that's something that's not done enough in the strength and conditioning setting and in the rehab setting as well, is how can we adjust what we're doing to the athlete in front of us? And I think that there's so many different approaches to get the result that you want. Give you an example about myself personally. I hate training barbell back squat for myself. I don't know why, I just always suck at it. But I love a safety squat bar. And I can throw, 545s on a safety squat bar and rep that out, no big deal. But if you put a barbell on my back, 315 feels like 3,000. I can't
Sure.
explain why it is, but I just, find that I train best with a safety squat bar, and I'm not training for a powerlifting event, at least not anytime soon. So
Mhm.
I'm okay with that swap for myself. And the same thing comes, with our athletes that way. And I think that concept, like we mentioned before about self-experimentation with our program, like, if we're working with athletes in this setting, I think that we ourselves should be training in some capacity. And if
Oh
we're
yeah,
not, and we don't understand what it's like to have that kind of grind and stimulus, then we're really doing our athletes a disservice because we don't understand what they're going through.
100%. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're a great example of like, yeah, just safety squat then, you know? I think that there are some reasons, especially like, in a team setting where maybe you do a little bit of the square peg round hole, right? For example, if I've been in situations where like, all right, hey, we need to, our key lift is going to be a, power clean for this team, right? Well, if you never ever front squat, it's tough to build that power clean, right? And so, depending on your situation, and it's like, well, all right, we need to work on building the ability to do that front squat so we can do that power clean. Like, I get that, certainly. And, again, I'm fortunate enough to be in a place where I can individualize as much as I feel necessary. But to go back to kind of what you said about simplification, I think a great example of this is my friend and office mate, Eric Hernandez. He'll tell you, right? And his programs are very simple, but he has mastered and is really, really great at getting his teams to master the basics, right? They front squat incredibly well. They bench press well. They power clean very well. It's like if everybody was able to do those things, they all do really great full range of motion chin ups. It's like everybody can do that. We'd be in a much better spot, and so I think it's lost on people sometimes where, yeah, guess what? Coming in every week and doing front squats and chin ups and bench presses is boring, but it is incredibly effective. And so you might see this fancy exercise on Instagram that you want to sprinkle in. The big stuff works because it works, right? Like it's tried and true, and you'll get the benefit that you're looking for instead of swaying off program and doing the latest and greatest, Instagram post.
Exactly. And it's so funny because the other word I keep seeing online a lot is the word optimal. Like this is the optimal way to train your back or the optimal way to train your lat fibers. And it's like, do we really need the most optimal or do we really just need to load the sucker? Like
there are, 1% of the 1% need to find optimal.
Yeah.
Right. And those people, hey, more power to you. You find the optimal way to train your back for your context. But for the other 99.99%, do something and be consistent with it. Right. To the general population, I say literally do anything and it's gonna be better than nothing. Right.
Yeah.
To some of the high level athletes who may be listening to this, I think we have to be closer to optimal, right? We have to try to match the demands of our sport, right? We need to match certain intensities and energy systems related to our sport. But even in like our level at Carolina, like we're still not necessarily in that 1% of 1%, right?
Yep.
Some of our athletes might be darn close, but even then, it's like we've got some who are elite athletes who can only do one chin up, right? So let's find what does optimal mean for your context.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's such a great point is optimal varies so much based on the person in front of us. So, again, what's optimal for one person is not optimal for the next. And it's so interesting because as we're establishing our KPIs, it's like, to your point, we might have the best athlete on the team who sucks at a certain exercise and we get them better at that exercise and their performance on the field doesn't change. So it's almost like we have to select our KPIs from an exercise standpoint accordingly because we sometimes put our stock in the wrong thing. And that's where you as the sports science data guy comes into play, because you speak that world so much better than I do. And that's kind of where I see the optimal side really coming in, is how do we match what we do carry over to what we need to do in the sport that way.
Yeah.
And going back to your point on Eric and mastering the basics and that sort of thing that way, I mean, that guy is a legend, and some of the stuff I see him posting, he's got girls doing weighted chin-ups with weights that I sometimes struggle with. It's wicked impressive. And it's one of those things that, again, they probably don't necessarily care about back development or the exact right angle to do a lat pull down at when they can rep out weighted chin-ups. So it's
Exactly.
one of
Yeah.
those things where, determining what are the big buckets that way. And I know you mentioned front squat and pull up and different things in that kind of regard. And I think that putting stock in a lot of those different compound movements, and even just not being afraid to throw a machine exercise in there too. I think
Oh,
machines often get a
100%.
bad rep, and machines are much better than we think they are a lot of times.
Absolutely.
But I think that those things are really where the bulk of our time should be spent. I think that the more we get lost in this world of the exact right angle and the exact appropriate setup, it's like nothing is going to be exact and appropriate and optimal on the field. Like, athletes are master compensators, and every single step, every single movement they make, they're trying to solve another movement problem. So, if we are always so hyper fixated on this exact way to move, then we're, again, doing them a disservice, because they play in a chaotic environment. So our training as a result should not be so regimented and restricted to a certain angle only to hit a certain type of fiber of a certain type of muscle of a certain type of fascicle. I don't even know.
I think sometimes too, right? Like I tell people on Instagram or on Twitter that understand what you are in this field, right? You are not Michelangelo crafting sculpture of David, right? At best, you are the miner who got the clay out of the ground. The athlete is Michelangelo. They're going to take that and make something beautiful out of it. Don't confuse yourself with Michelangelo here, right? I think everybody's like, oh well, like I crafted that athlete from nothing. It's like, okay, well, that's hilarious because they were going to be great no matter what. Along with that, I think it's important and okay to, like, yeah, if I have an athlete who does something good, I'm going to celebrate that on social media because I had a non-0% involvement in helping that athlete succeed. And in this field in particular, this is kind of a side tangent, take your wins because we do a thankless job usually. When we win, the head coach and athletes get all the glory. When we lose, we get a lot of the blame. So take your wins. I'm okay with that. But understand what you did, right? Understand that you are not in this field, you're not crafting them from nothing into glory, right? Like, just understanding like our place and some perspective, I think would help temper some of the nonsense you see on the internet. But again, that's just me.
That's a great take and a great point to make, because you're right. I do see a lot of people online who take credit for everything. Like, look at what I got the athlete to do, or look at how I built this athlete. Phrases like that are far too common. I see it the same thing in the PT space as well, right? Athlete gets injured and the PT tries to take all the credit for getting him back. And it's like, even in my ACL rehabs, we're getting 80 to 100 visits max, and athletes are coming back. So at most, I'm spending 80 to 90 hours over a 9 to 12 month time period with that athlete. I really can't take the bulk of the credit for that. Yeah, I played a role, but at the end
Sure.
of the day, I'm kind of like the Google Maps. I'm the GPS. I'm just kind of guiding them where to go. They have to be able to walk that walk and put in the work. And, sometimes I've got to be the cheerleader for them to want to do that work, but, they've got to put it in themselves. And I think that a lot of times we get so caught up in this thought that we are doing the work for them, when in reality it's them putting in the time and effort and energy, and us just kind of supporting that process. To your other point as well, I do think a lot of strength coaches do not get the credit and appreciation that they deserve. And I think that social media, in a good light, has allowed some of them to really, quote unquote, make it. I think
Yeah,
a lot of
100%.
strength coaches, as you mentioned, don't often get verbal respect and appreciation, but some of them are highly underpaid for the work that they do. And some of them have been able
Some, I would say
to
most.
and some of them are able to, supplement their income with different things online. And I
Absolutely.
am all here for that. As long as what you're doing is not injuring people or causing harm or, having any kind of negative effect on people that way, if it's for the greater good, then I'm going to support it. And if it helps you win, I'm here for it. At the end of the day, if
Absolutely.
everyone is winning, then who is there? What is there to complain about, I guess?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up sort of like social media in like a positive light, because I don't want to, take away from this thing as, oh, social media is all bad. No, of course not, right? Like, obviously I kind of mentioned it at the start, but like we have access to all of the world's knowledge at our fingertips. And so like if I want to know how the strength coach for, X university runs their stuff, I'll just DM them and like, hey, what kind of strength and conditioning you doing? And again, this field is fantastic and where everybody's pretty collaborative. And so, 10 years ago, you couldn't do that, right? Like nobody knew what everybody else was doing. So like that is a huge plus. I mean, the ability to stay connected with people is a massive plus, right? Like you and I sending memes back and forth, right? Like brightens up my day, and so, I think that I don't want the takeaway from all this to be social media is all bad. No, it's absolutely valuable, and there's a reason that I still have it on my phone. But again, it's reframing the perspective of what it is. And I think it's being a little introspective and understanding like, am I critically thinking enough for this to be a useful tool for my life?
Yeah.
Right. And if you're willing to do that, I mean, I think that social media can be incredibly positive and beneficial, and I know certainly for me, like I'm going to share every success of an athlete that I've ever had. Somebody gets drafted, somebody goes to the Olympics, somebody wins a ton, right? Like, yes, I know I did not, right, score that goal, but I'm very proud of that athlete. And I want, I think like I should be proud of that. I should, it's okay. Right. And I love, being able to do that. And, I love, again, being able to be creatively sparked by social media. I love that I can learn from people who I wouldn't normally see in my day to day. And so it definitely has its positives. And so, I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, plain and simple, the podcast would not be what it is today if it wasn't for social media.
Right.
The amount of connections I've made because of social media, and I should add to that, the amount of insane connections I've made because of Instagram and just being willing to send a DM and reach out to people is just
Yeah.
absolutely incredible. And you're right,
Yeah.
that kind of thing would not have existed years ago. And it's so interesting to me as well how open people are to connecting a lot of time.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you're like the athlete or the student or still in school or still trying to learn or whatever your title is really at the end of the day, like send a DM and just reach out to someone because you never know. You might end up connecting with them. You might end up on a phone call with them. You might end up having them on your podcast, whatever it is that way. Like there's certainly so much value from the connectivity side that way. You brought up the memes, and I mean, you're right. The humor online is absolutely unmatched.
The
Sometimes I open
internet
it.
is undefeated.
Yeah.
In every situation, the internet memes always win.
Huge shout out to Austin Yoakum, past podcast guest, who also
Sure.
came from an Instagram DM. But also, as far as I'm concerned, the dude is like the boogeyman and the king of the meme world for strength and
Yes.
conditioning right now. And that's
Hmm.
that's the kind of stuff that always brightens my day when I open that up and see that.
Do you want to rapid fire some Instagram accounts that either are terrible or make you laugh?
For sure. So Jared, give me a rundown. Just
All right.
real
So the
quick.
first
Give me
one,
5 or 10 really good Instagram accounts you love and 5 or 10 Instagram accounts that
oh,
I don't want to use the word hate, but 5 or 10 that maybe you have found the juice is not worth the squeeze for in what you're trying to accomplish personally. Just your personal take on that.
yeah. What's funny is it's so easy to think of the ones that I don't respect at all and laugh at. And yet it's so hard for me to think of those that do incredibly good work. Isn't
Well,
that
the
amazing?
good ones, Eric Hernandez, John Lamb,
100%. All
Hugh
the
Wiley,
cardio
I think you
performance.
mentioned AJ
Yep.
Blue. Yeah.
Anybody to do with University of North Carolina. uh, yeah, and I think that there's fantastic people on Instagram for sure. Yeah, all of those. I can shout out any of the coaches that I've worked with in the past. Don't know their handles off the top of my head, but a guy named Will Otto from Penn State, fantastic coach, fantastic human. Lou Portiazzo, Trevor Klump from University of Michigan, like fantastic people, fantastic coaches. Like, the list goes on, and I feel as though I could talk forever. Guy named Vance Newgard, he was weightlifting coach at Northern Michigan, who taught me a ton about weightlifting and coaching and this whole field. All of them are on Instagram, and by all means, take a look at them. And it comes down to, for me, a lot of the people that I follow are people that I've known, and hopefully the algorithm can serve me up new people as much as possible. But again, I'm also not a social media guy. I want to preface everything I said, and will say with, I'm not a social media guy. And again, if you gave me 100,000 followers tomorrow, I don't think I would do anything differently. Can you get paid with 100,000 followers? I don't even know. Does that help? I don't know. Like,
You're
what's the
asking the
number?
wrong person. I have not hit that viral reel yet to get there.
I know that at the top level, people make a lot of money from social media, but like, what's the number? Is it 10,000, 100, a million? Like, I don't know.
Forget minimum effective dose to exercise. I want minimum effective dose to social media.
Yeah, the real question is, when do I quit my job? Is really no. The funny Instagram accounts that make me laugh, and I would not necessarily buy into a lot of their training methodologies. The first one I always think about is the Liver King. Yeah, I mean, the dude has been juicing since day one. So if you think that's an attainable physique, nothing to tell you. I may have a bridge to sell you though, if that's the case. The knees over toes movement is good training, right? I think the marketing outweighs the training, and I think a lot of people would be better served Googling who Charles Poliquin was than just following blindly the knees over toes, because a lot of those principles came directly from him. Who else is out there? There's a group out there that I may or may not have gotten into a fight with at one point, called GOATA, Greatest of All Time Athletes. Oh, if you've never heard of them, it's a funny one. I don't know how to describe their philosophies. They look at video of elite athletes and say these are the patterns to mimic, but also it's very unclear as to who they deem as elite and sub-elite. For example, LeBron James would be considered sub-elite. I don't know. They have some very funny videos using spirals and Fibonacci sequences and math, but there's no math to describe why movement is good or bad. It's entertaining. Probably not a viable training philosophy for my populations, but yeah. And there's plenty of others that pop up along the way. Some big, some small, but I think it's a matter of let's critically think what we see. Have our fun, obviously, with some of the jokier ones, but at the same time, I think it's okay to call each other out and hold us to a higher standard, right? I've had to call out friends for stuff that I think is just not accurate, right? A good friend of mine that I went to undergrad with is a personal trainer, and a very good one. Had some posts that, again, I would say were at best inaccurate, at worst potentially harmful to somebody who doesn't know better. And so I called him out for it. He was not happy. And it's easy for me to say this, being a guy with maybe a dozen followers and never post anything. Well, yes, I get that, but again, I always say, like, our field needs to be better, and I want the best for all of our clients, our athletes, and those that we serve. And being held to a higher standard on social media, I think, should be a part of that.
Agreed. And you bring up such an interesting point there on, the concept of the call out, so to speak. What do you feel is the best way or most appropriate way to call someone out or have that discussion politely when you may or may not agree that way?
I think the best way and the most effective way is probably not the most appropriate way, if that makes sense. For example, if you want to get a post taken down immediately, just comment on it and say, hey, this is wrong. Whereas, the approach that I usually like to take is send a DM, right? Like, hey, I saw your post on this topic, and I think that this language could be potentially harmful for somebody, or hey, maybe this would be a good exercise in a better context, right? And so just trying to give them a little bit of behind the scenes insight. And then if they're like, well, no, dude, you're the worst, I hate you, it's like, okay, well, now we'll put that out for the world to see. And then maybe it's a matter of, hey, share it and tell people, hey, this guy's an idiot. I don't know.
No, I think that's a great way to look at it. And again, it's one of those things where just remembering that the person on the other side of the keyboard is a person too. And
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
maybe they have a bad intention. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're just a little bit misinformed. We'll
Totally.
call it.
Yeah.
So just
So again, 2020 version of me was just attacking everybody left and right. I think it was, again, I was too cooped up. I regret it. I deleted a lot of comments. It is what it is. You're absolutely right. Like, and this just goes beyond social media, but I think especially on social media, it's like, show people some grace. Call them out, sure, but do it respectfully. I know that when I see a text or a DM or a comment on something, like, I assume good intent until somebody shows me otherwise. And I really, really try to hold myself to that. Some language, I kind of like it. I don't know. It didn't seem like it was great intent, but I think it's just good practice for us moving forward. And this is not just in the fitness space, but in sports that can get us all fired up, in politics, in life. It's I think it's a good practice for us to approach every situation with grace and good intent. And let's try to work together on things instead of just straight up tear down. And so that's why I try to use a ton of emojis and smiley faces, so that over text that, hey, I mean this as well as I possibly can, right? When I'm telling you, you're inaccurately representing the results of that study. Hey, I mean this in the best way possible. I just want to let you know that that's not actually what the study said, and maybe it would be a good idea to change it to something like this. And hopefully it goes over well. But again, like, if we can approach all of social media with some of that grace, I think it would go a long way.
Yeah, no, agreed. And it you brought up so many amazing points. I mean, first off, the concept of we just want everyone to win. Like, that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Like, I don't care, if like I at the end of the day, I'll say it like this. If the tide rises, all the ships in the water are going to be elevated.
Right.
So why do we care about pushing someone else down when it's not going to help any of us? Let's just
Right.
help everyone get better and learn a little bit more. You also referenced the studies point that way, and it is interesting because I do see a lot of research get misinterpreted that way in order to prove a point. And again, maybe it's not always intentional. I do try and give people the benefit of the doubt as often as I can.
Certainly,
Certainly something to be aware of.
especially on that one. It's one that I see probably the most commonly is like a misrepresentation of literature, where maybe somebody skimmed an abstract and then made an Instagram post about it. And like, I understand that most people aren't like overly scientifically trained and understand how to read literature. And so that one, certainly a lot more grace is given. And it's like, maybe if it's not something that's that big a deal, just let it slide. But certainly if somebody's using research to say that, hey, all back squats will hurt your back, it's like, okay, well, don't think the research says that. But yeah.
Jared, I feel like you and I could probably talk about this all day long. And I feel like if we kept going, we'd eventually solve most of the world's problems at this point.
I mean, we're already halfway there, truthfully.
Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything we might have missed as we were chatting today?
Just for the kind of the lay person when looking at social media, I think, there's a few criteria to evaluate outside of just follower count. Um, looking at, say, a coach, understanding, one, are they educated, right? If somebody has a PhD, it's probably a good indicator of they know what they're talking about. Not always. There's certainly PhDs who do not know what they're talking about, but that's like a starting point. I kind of look and see, well, did this person get success in whatever area they're trying to coach you? For example, if you're looking for a bodybuilding program and they've never produced any bodybuilders of any kind, probably not the best place to go for bodybuilding advice, right? For example, I've seen a lot of people who are trying to coach women's lacrosse players who've never been around women's lacrosse. It's like, well, maybe find a lacrosse coach, right? Or looking at the person and like, did you succeed yourself? Are they an N equals one success study? For example, if one of my lacrosse players wanted to coach somebody on how to play lacrosse, yeah, they're probably pretty good at that, and maybe they're not the best lacrosse coach out there, but I think they have a lot more that to stand on than just the average rando. And if you can take those three things into account, it's a good starting point to understand like where those social media posts are coming from. And of course, last but certainly not least, is to approach everything with positivity and grace and give people a little bit of benefit of the doubt. If you see something on the internet that you like, that is bad, well, maybe there's some context that it's not bad, right? And if you are going to call somebody out, like I have done before, do it nicely.
Yeah, no, agreed. And you certainly will burn less bridges doing it nicely, because
Yeah,
maybe you don't agree with what that person said, but maybe someone else who you really want to get connected with does. So
right. Yeah,
don't.
and on that side of things, I think it's the hardest part is towing that line between holding a high standard while also giving grace. I love this field too much to see it besmirched, and so there is a threshold. I don't know what it is, but there's a threshold for me of misinformation that triggers that for me to want to call something out. For the most part, I try to keep as quiet as possible or to encourage with here's some resources to maybe get better. That's the hardest part, and I don't like the negativity that it sometimes brings, but we need to be better, and that's what I hope for.
Since we've talked about social media for so long, Jared, for people who want to find you on social media, I should probably be dropping a MySpace link in the description, or
I mean, yes, that's probably my most active social media. No, the most active I am is on Instagram. That's coach_Jarvi on Instagram. I may or may not respond to DMs within 7 to 10 business days. No promises on that. But certainly if anybody hears this and is like, I want to ask that dude a question about training, about life, about what would I do, I will try my best to answer those. Other than that, not a big social media guy.
yeah, I was gonna say the next time I DM you, we're probably gonna end up talking about like aliens or something like that.
You never know. You never know.
I think the other real question is, when is the UNC Strength and Conditioning TikTok channel going to come to life?
That makes me laugh because knowing our staff, nobody will start that. I think Eric is certainly the most social media savvy, but he will never be on TikTok.
That's funny. So we'll link to all of your links in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and reach out to Jared. So really appreciate your time today, buddy. It was great chatting, and always good kind of running the run with you.
Yeah, Dan, absolutely. I mean, let's feel free to do this again sometime. Again, we have half the world's problems left to go, so we'll get it done then.